Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 5923, the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act of 2023, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 272, H.R. 5923. A bill to impose restrictions on correspondent and payable through accounts in the United States with respect to Chinese financial institutions that conduct transactions involving the purchase of petroleum or petroleum products from Iran.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 5923, the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act, sponsored by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler. Currently, Iran is subject to a comprehensive set of sanctions. We know there are loopholes. Under current law, the President is required to blacklist foreign financial institutions that undertake significant transactions with sanctioned Iranian banks. However, we know that these significant transactions are leaving much of the country's energy trade untouched. Last year, Iran's oil exports rose by 50%, reaching a 5-year high. Most of these exports went to China. Mr. Lawler's bill makes clear that any petroleum-related transaction between Iran and China, no matter how small, will put Chinese banks at risk of being sanctioned. Closing this loophole is essential to ensuring China's financial institutions begin to finally crack down on this illicit oil trade. Additionally, I'm pleased to see this legislation includes a proposal offered by Mr. Foster of Illinois. When we reported this legislation in November, Mr. Foster and Mr. Lawler discussed the inclusion of tougher sanctions to target Iran's sales of unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. This is now included in the text we are considering today. News of this weekend's actions by Iran against our most sacred ally in the world, Israel, is a good example of why we need this law and this bill. Iran has become a major supplier of UAV technologies to Russia and other rogue regimes. We see this in Ukraine. We saw that of the targeting of Israel this weekend. And providing the Ayatollahs with funds by these UAV sales, they can be recycled for terrorism purposes. The sooner we put an end to these exports, the better. And again, I want to thank Mr. Lawler for his leadership on authoring this bill, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support it. And with that, I will now yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership in getting this bill to the floor. And I want to thank my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, my co-lead on this bill. I rise in support of this legislation, H.R. 5923, the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act. Iran is exporting around 1.5 million barrels of petroleum per day, its highest level in 4 years. Around 80% of these exports go to China, providing Tehran with revenues that keep their coffers filled and enable Iran's sponsorship of terrorism abroad, including backing Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Make no mistake, the October 7th attack on Israel would not have been possible without Iranian support. And this weekend's brazen assault on Israel demonstrates Iran's intentions have not wavered. They want to eradicate the state of Israel from the face of the earth. My bill targets independent Chinese oil refiners, so-called teapots, which have been driving China's purchases of Iranian crude. Unlike state-owned refiners that have retreated from the market, teapots are less exposed to blocking sanctions and deal in more limited quantities. However, teapots aren't completely beyond our reach. The United States also wields secondary sanctions that punish foreign financial institutions that work with Iran's banks in order to deal in Iranian crude. This is where the bill comes in. While these teapots may not have economic ties to the U.S. that would make them wary of sanctions, Chinese and other foreign financial institutions that work with teapots do deal with the U.S. financial system. Therefore, my bill expands the law's definition to ensure that any dealings they have with Iran-sanctioned financial institutions, including the Iranian Central Bank, will lead to the closure of their correspondent accounts in our country. These secondary sanctions complement the SHIP Act, a bill I sponsored that would impose sanctions on ports and refineries that take in petroleum from Iran. The House passed the SHIP Act in October and has been waiting for Senate Democrats to take up the bill ever since. It's critical that the Senate bring this bill and the SHIP Act up for votes. Enough is enough. We cannot let Iran continue in its efforts to destroy Israel, establish regional dominance, and destabilize the entire free world. And addressing their oil trade revenues is perhaps the best way to accomplish this. This common-sense, bipartisan piece of legislation would do just that and would significantly reduce Iran's ability to project power in the region, fund terrorist groups, and attack our closest ally, Israel, both on its own or through its proxies. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of my bipartisan bill, the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act, to hold two members of the axis of evil, some of our greatest, most dangerous adversaries, the governments of Iran and China, accountable for their nefarious activities. I'm very proud to lead this legislation with my fellow Problem Solvers Caucus member, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler. China, and I want to thank the chairman as well, who always does a phenomenal job on the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. China is Iran's biggest customer of oil and a major supplier of Iran's missile and drone program. Despite strict U.S. sanctions designed to curb the Iranian regime's oil trade, China has tripled its imports of Iranian oil over the past 2 years. As we speak, Iran is using its oil trade with China to bring in a staggering $150 million per day in revenue. By importing millions of barrels of oil a day, China keeps the Iranian regime in business and provides crucial funds for Tehran's chaos agenda, including missile and nuclear weapons development. But China isn't just providing indirect funding. Reporting last year indicated that China is considering supplying Iran with ammonia, a key chemical compound used to propel ballistic missiles. Just 3 days after an unprecedented attack, when Iran launched more than 300 drones, ballistic and cruise missiles at our key democratic ally Israel, this partnership should sound major alarms. If all of this wasn't concerning enough, China also disregards Iran's backing of terror groups and their proxies, including the Houthis, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and of course, Hamas. Last month, Chinese diplomats met with Hamas after they brutally killed more than 1,200 innocent babies, children, men, women, and the elderly, including Americans, and said absolutely nothing about its barbaric attack on October 7th. Unlike China, we cannot and should not stand by in the face of terrorism. We must vehemently oppose terrorist sympathizers, sponsors, and supporters in all forms. That's why I'm also supporting H.R. 6408, which would amend the tax code to terminate the tax-exempt status of terror-supporting nations, including those who cheer on and provide material support on Iran and its proxies. And I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Schneider, for his phenomenal leadership, Mr. Kustoff. Hamas relies on support from the Iranian regime, the leading state sponsor of terror. As Iran deepens its ties to China, we are reminded that they cannot be trusted. Iran has directly or through their terrorist proxies killed hundreds of Americans and attacked our bases and our allies in the region. All of this is why we must pass the bipartisan Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act to cut off sources of funding to Iran. This bipartisan legislation, which unanimously passed the House Financial Services Committee, expands sanctions to cover Chinese financial institutions that purchase petroleum products from Iran. The bill also requires an annual determination as to whether Chinese financial institutions have engaged in sanctionable conduct. We must continue to support and we must continue to sanction those who are involved in the import of Iranian oil, including financial institutions. This bill will do just that. The Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act is urgently needed to cut off and deny resources to the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. China can no longer remain Iran's top customer. I'll continue to fight against Iran's growing influence and make sure we do everything in our power to protect the U.S. and its allies, including Israel, from Iran. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will join us to support this common-sense, bipartisan legislation. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, my friend and a great leader, Mr. Foster.
One's recognized.
Thank you, Representative Gottheimer, and as well as Chair McHenry, Representatives Lawler, and to my Republican Democratic colleagues who've made this bill come to the floor. I rise in support of H.R. 5923, the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act. Thanks to Representative Lawler's bipartisan efforts, this legislation now includes an amendment that I proposed during the Financial Services Committee's consideration of this bill, which would empower the administration to go after Iran's production of unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones, that are now being used against our allies abroad. It is essential for us to work aggressively to cut off the flow of money that Iran, a known sponsor of terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, is using to fund violence and disrupt commerce around the world. Just last weekend, Iran sent more than 300 drones to attack Israel. According to the Atlantic Council, it is a steady supply of Iranian drones that allows Russia to continue its intensive bombing campaign against Ukraine. We also know that Iran is building drones and sharing its technology and expertise with its proxies in the Middle East. Drones and related technologies are changing the tactics used on the modern battlefield. They can be deployed in large numbers, as they were in Israel last weekend, in an attempt to overwhelm air defenses and strike critical infrastructure far from the front lines. Small and commercially available drones are also being used and converted to carry munitions capable of inflicting significant damage at relatively low cost. This legislation will crack down on the financing that makes Iran's support of our adversaries possible. Specifically, the language that I drafted will empower the Treasury to sanction any financial institution involved in the purchase of Iranian drones, parts, or related systems. We have seen the damage that drones are doing in Israel and Ukraine, and expanding this legislation to go after Iran's drone production is an important step to support our allies abroad. I support this legislation and encourage my colleagues to vote yes. Thank you, and yield back.
Yields. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers and prepare to close. The gentleman from North Carolina has no further speakers.
The gentleman reserves.
Reserve. I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman reserves. Recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of the time. I just want to close by saying that we must all continue to fight against Iran's growing influence and ensure we do everything in our power to protect the United States and its allies, including Israel, from Iran, especially after what we saw this weekend. It only reinforces what Iran is capable of, either directly or through its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis. There are so many areas where Iran continues to not just attack our key allies, including Israel, but also the United States of America. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will join us to support this common sense bipartisan legislation. Again, I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Lawler, for his leadership, and Chairman McHenry for his. And with that, I yield.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I think this is an important bill that is timely, quite timely. We reported this bill out in November when we could have had more restrictive action against the Iranian regime than is currently in place by this administration, a more aggressive stance against folks regimes that want to do harm globally. This is an important bill that is bipartisan out of the House Financial Services Committee. I want to commend Mr. Gottheimer and Mr. Lawler for their work here, as well as Mr. Foster's important addition to the bill. So it's a bipartisan product that is quite timely for us to put further restrictions on the Iranian regime. With that, I ask the support from my colleagues and ask for a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.